Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We can just see the attendee list populating here, so we're just going to wait about 20 seconds just to let everybody get signed in here. Okay, awesome. So let's get started. Thanks again for joining us on today's webinar, where we'll be talking about the impact of GDPR 1 year on. The introduction of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, on May 1st, 2018, had a significant impact on the way businesses secure their customer data. Despite there being a long period in which companies were able to implement the required changes to become GDPR compliant, many companies weren't actually ready by May 1st. In the year that's passed, we've seen companies block their websites from EU visitors, as well as seeing fines being handed out to some of the biggest companies in the world, most recently Google. Today, we're going to be walking through the impact of GDPR in more detail. So today's webinar is hosted by myself, Coralie Wood. I've worked in digital for over 10 years and have a first-hand experience of helping hundreds of companies become GDPR compliant. Joining me is LoginRadius Product Marketing Manager, Alice Liang. Alice is passionate about empowering companies to provide a better user experience by protecting their customer data. We're also thrilled to be joined by Sam Wong from Microsoft. Sam is the Enterprise Mobility and Security Marketing Lead for Microsoft Canada, where she oversees the strategy and execution for all things security. Now, before we get started, we do just want to let you know that there will be a Q&A section at the end of today's webinar. You should see a questions pane on your screen right now. Please feel free to ask us anything you like as we move along, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Okay, so I think we're ready to get started. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Alice.
Awesome, thanks Coralie. So before I get started, I just want to run through kind of a few points that we're going to be talking about today. First, we're just going to look at a brief summary of what GDPR is and essentially some of the consequences and whatnot that comes with that regulation. And then we're going to look into the past year, GDPR in practice, how that's impacted businesses and consumers alike. And then we'll have Microsoft Spotlight, where Sam will be talking about compliance in the GDPR world in relation to Microsoft Azure. And then kind of tying everything together, we're going to kind of highlight customer identity and GDPR and how that relates and how that can help your compliance. So first, a brief summary of GDPR and what it is. So it stands for General Data Protection Regulation, as I'm sure some of you already know. Came into effect in May of 2018. And really the goal of this is kind of unifying that data protection and giving the control back to the individual citizens and residents over their personal data. And even though this is an EU regulation, it's not just European law. It really affects every business that processes personal data that belongs to EU citizens. So even if your business is based out of Canada or the States, really, as long as you're processing data, as long as at least one of your users is an EU citizen, then you are obligated to comply with GDPR. A few of the key elements of this regulation, again, like I mentioned, applies to all organizations that processes data from EU citizens. By data, we really mean any personally identifiable data. And with the advancement of technology, this has now been being brought in to include anything like cookies, mobile IDs, geolocation. So really any data that really can pinpoint down who the individual is. And comes with this is also the consumer's right to access the information at all times, as well as the right to be forgotten. So really, the consumers now have the control to give permission or take away permission at any time for businesses to gather or share their data. And then a few key compliance points for businesses that they have to look into is the transparency. Maintaining transparency about what data is gathered and why they're gathering that data, as well as detailed records of all consumer interactions, and giving their customers the ability to withdraw consent or delete accounts at will. And then again, a big part of this, since it is personal information, a big part of this is security. So making sure that there is default data encryption in place for to protect the data that you're gathering. As well, should there be a breach, your businesses now are business needs to essentially notify of the breach within 72 hours. And as well, they need to make sure that all personal data collected over time is accounted for to make sure that nothing is lost, and that kind of loops us back to that transparency aspect of it. And then, of course, there's some repercussions for failing to comply. It starts off with a written warning, and then there will be some strict periodic data audits. And then regarding fines, there's actually 2 tiers of fines depending on which GDPR articles are breached. The first tier is a fine up to 10 million euros, or 2% of your annual income, whichever is greater. The second tier, again, is up to 20 million euros, or 4% of the business's annual income. And then one of the key kind of repercussions of this, on top of the fines, is really the company's reputation. You know, this will lead into implications around customer trust and the company's credibility as well. So having said that, we can take a look at kind of GDPR in practice and kind of what has happened in the past year. So since it became effective, some websites and some businesses have limited their access to more of a regional access. So one good example of this is Sephora. So they used to provide access to their different sites for different countries. You can access the American site from a different country, and vice versa, because different countries, sometimes they have different products. So since GDPR went into effect, Sephora has essentially removed that capability. So if you are based in the EU, you can only access the EU sites and such. Along with that, there has been 40,000 data breach notifications reported across the EU, and even currently there is 225 ongoing investigations of GDPR violations. On top of that, there has been 3 fines issued for GDPR violations, the largest amount being 50 million euros for Google for essentially lack of consent while processing personal data. And that kind of brings us into a few challenges we've seen in the past year. So based on a survey done, so as of the end of 2018, more than 50% of organizations are still not fully compliant yet, and about about 1/5 of those organizations essentially admit full compliance is almost impossible for them. Another side to this is a hiring increase. So there's job creation around this as kind of companies realize the importance of internal privacy teams, of hiring privacy professionals to oversee, building those processes, to oversee their compliance regulations and such. And then the average spend is around 1.3 million so far, with an additional 1.8 million expected. And that's per organization. And then kind of on the flip side, into the consumers and the customers' point of view, customers now have a clearly defined rights around the collection and usage of their data, right? So kind of brings us back to that where that transparency is key, as customers can request to see their data, request to see what is being processed about them at any time. And then kind of tied in with this is having that understanding, having that control back to the data. Customers can now essentially make complaints or kind of reflect directly into what is being happened to their data. So there's a total number of complaints received between May of 2018 and January, so that's about 6 months or 7 months, is 95,000. And the most common type of complaints are around telemarketing, promotional emails, and video surveillance. And one of the 3 fines that were issued is actually around video surveillance and not communicating, not gathering that customer consent when for the footage. And a few of the unexpected consequences. actually include, one of them is opt-in fatigue. I'm sure myself, I definitely have seen this, and I'm sure lots of you have, within, you know, even just the last year or so. Most of the websites that we go into, anything that we click into, there's a lot of times a little pop-up that comes up that tells you, oh, do you give consent for us to, you know, here's a cookie, or for us to communicate this with you. So now it's becoming more of an annoyance than to the customers than anything else. Excuse me. And then another aspect of this, going to touch on this, the financial impact on smaller businesses. As we mentioned, it does require a decent amount of investment to become compliant, which may be a burden for smaller companies that may not have those resources available. And another aspect that we kind of touched on already too is a restricted technology access for EU citizens. There are now websites and applications made that are unavailable to EU citizens simply because those companies that are behind those sites or behind those applications just don't have the means to become compliant. So they just restrict access altogether. And then another more kind of direct consequence is that now there are other countries taking similar action. So it's moved beyond just strategizing or kind of making promises. Now it's actually happening. So one of the most prominent examples is the California Privacy Act that is taking place January of next year.
Awesome. Thanks, Alice. So now we've seen a little bit about how GDPR works in practice. What we'll do now is hand over to Sam, who's going to be giving us an overview of how Microsoft Azure can help you protect personal data. So Sam, we'll hand over to you. Oh, it looks like we're just having a small technical difficulty, Sam, I think. We're just not getting your...
There we go.
Awesome. Hi, Sam.
Awesome. Sorry about that. Just the mute button was giving me a little bit of trouble. Thanks, Coralie. So hi, hello, everyone. I'm here to talk to you today about Azure and compliance in this GDPR world. So first, I want to dive into, the why Azure story and why, we believe Microsoft Azure is, the journey to go for your compliance journey. So trust is central to Microsoft's mission to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. We are dedicated to promoting policies for a trusted, responsible, and inclusive cloud. It's important for our customers to know that our focus on being a trusted partner, and this starts at the top. So when thinking through different cloud providers, it's important to look at the actions they are taking. Here you see some examples of actions that we've taken that demonstrate our commitment to being a trusted partner to our customers. So one thing I want to call out is just that we also proactively collaborate with customers and regulators on shaping compliance. So we're often the first global cloud service provider to adopt new frameworks and standards. In addition, we also work with industry leaders and government bodies around the world to anticipate future compliance requirements. So with Microsoft, Azure is built on trust, and Microsoft builds trust into Azure from the ground up with security, privacy, compliance, and transparency. Microsoft has more industry certifications than any other cloud provider. Microsoft, and Azure in particular, has the deepest and most comprehensive compliance coverage in the industry. Azure compliance coverage currently includes 72 offerings, and Microsoft has a commitment to leading the industry in GDPR compliance. With 54 Azure regions around the world, Microsoft looked at building data centers differently. Not only do we have a massive infrastructure, but rather than just thinking about a few large regions, we've actually thought more about the complex engineering that has to happen to data centers in multiple regions to be closer to where you are and to also meet data sovereignty requirements. So also Azure provides you unmatched security. Microsoft invests more than $1 billion a year and employs more than 3,500 security full-time experts to protect your information. Microsoft offers threat protection, which is informed by trillions of signals that we receive every day from more than about 1.2 billion devices that we scan of more than 700 million Azure users' account authentications. So the first component is the secure foundation of Azure, like our physical infrastructure, the biometric security to get into one of our physical data centers. The second component is the security technology. Security is built into our tools. It's not a bolted-on solution. This will help you secure your environment, which includes the identity, the network, the threat protection, and the management of this. This volume of data is unprecedented, and we provide you with our unique intelligence with threat protection so you can quickly mitigate against any of your threats. So our strength is definitely can be seen in the numbers, right? Our strength is enabling customers such as yourselves. Over 95% of Fortune 500 companies are using Azure today. So now that you understand the why Azure, I want to switch gears to see how our cloud will help you with your compliance journey. So this is a world that many of our customers are moving to in terms of their digital transformation. And when it comes to being compliant in the intelligent cloud and intelligent edge era, we have to think about we have to consider what is our digital estate. How do we think about where our most sensitive data is? How do we protect that? How do we find what's most relevant? This is a little bit different now than it was about 5 or 10 years ago. IT organizations now find themselves responsible for finding and protecting data across a wide spectrum of devices and environments. So for example, user-owned mobile devices that access corporate data. It also includes systems and devices that your partners and customers use to access your information. And any one of these can be a point of compliance risk for your overall estate. That changes the game when it comes to compliance. You can no longer draw the parameters around your organization of establishing that one firewall, right? This is the challenge that we struggle with in compliance, and it's a challenge that we at Microsoft think that we can, uniquely fix. So one of the biggest challenges in compliance is the market is very fragmented and very confusing. There are dozens and dozens of categories of solutions, and within each of those categories, there are dozens or maybe even hundreds of solutions to choose from. So many of our customers today are struggling with just to figure out how many of those solutions do we need in place and where do we start? So the compliance landscape is continually evolving, and if you're a global organization or even one that is operating in 1 or 2 countries, the number of regulations you're subject to are constantly changing. In fact, a recent study that we did indicated that over 200 plus updates are provided per day from 900 regulatory bodies. So adding to this chaos, the electronic data continues to grow at an exponential rate, and it's increasing its complexity. So whereas before you were primarily dealing with documents and email, you're now dealing with instant messages, text messages, video files, images, audio files. So, and then on top of that, IoT, Internet of Things, will only add to this explosion of complexity. So understanding what data you have, what is sensitive, what is business critical, what needs to be kept and for how long, what can be deleted and when, is the utmost importance to maintaining that compliance. Data is also your greatest risk. Data is no longer just what we call an IT asset. It's the core strategic asset. And some types of data are more valuable than others. So confidential business information, which encompasses some things like company financials along with customer and even, we don't really think about this, employee data, is a highly strategic asset and an equally high value target for hackers to get onto. So protecting this data is definitely important. So we think about, the cost of compliance continues to grow each year. It continues to increase year over year, not only in terms of the processes, people, and technologies you need to be compliant, but also what is the cost of being non-compliant? So when we polled our customers last November, almost half of the executives weren't sure which standards applied to them, right? So managing compliance, especially for multinational organizations or small business, is a complex task that is difficult for many organizations to navigate. The requirements can be complex to interpret, it could be difficult to track, and definitely labor intensive to implement. It's even more challenging for regulated industries such as healthcare or financial services. So not only are there numerous standards and regulations, but they are constantly changing and making it difficult and expensive to keep abreast of international electronic data handling laws. So a great example of this is, the data explosion challenge and compliance with regulations is something that has been top of mind for last year for Microsoft, the GDPR. We spent a lot of time talking to our customers about GDPR compliance, how we've approached it, and what capabilities we are providing to help customers manage their compliance. And what we hear from customers is that protecting data is easier once they are in the cloud. We did the survey where 92% of ITDMs with their data in the cloud felt more confident that they could be compliant. What was most revealing to us, however, was what customers cared about when it comes to GDPR was not the fines, but understanding what personal data they had and how to protect that data. And this is aligned to Microsoft's perspective of GDPR. What is that privacy? Which is that privacy is a human right and should be extended to all and not just EU citizens. Here you go. And, definitely by not complying, the cost of non-compliance could be significant, as Alice alluded to a little bit earlier in regards to the amounts of fines that some companies could be facing. So, a couple of the statistical points I want to bring up is, currently to date, there's about 210 billion total annual cost of litigations within the Fortune 500. 51% of companies with over $1 billion in revenue indicate that they have at least one or more regulatory proceeding pending against them. 44% of organizations said that they have one internal investigation requiring the assistance of outside counsel during the prior year. And, astonishing 50% of organizations have spent more time during the last 3 years addressing regulatory requests or enforcing proceedings. So if you think about that, the goal here is to be proactive and not to be reactive and, to spend this type of money and when you can be proactive in finding a solution to help you. And this is how Microsoft, and in partnership with LoginRadius, we believe that can definitely help you. So LoginRadius can help you meet these responsibilities and achieve your business goals by assessing your current level of compliance risk and identifying ways to mitigate that risk. Help you maintain availability of your systems and services in a way that meets your responsibilities, and help you comply with the laws and regulations of your land. And lastly, definitely helping you protect that customer data that you have. So that's all from me today. Thanks, Coralie. I hope that definitely gives you coverage of, compliance in a GDPR world.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. We definitely appreciate that. So as we're all aware, GDPR is a regulation built entirely on how customer information is handled. So we're going to wrap up today by looking at how customer identity management simplifies your path to GDPR compliance. Alice, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam and Coralie. Let me just... Great. So kind of looping back to customer identity and GDPR and kind of tying in with what Sam had just said, essentially kind of looping back a little bit, just focusing on some of the challenges, we'll summarize some of the challenges that we've talked about so far. So one of the key things is maintaining a detailed records of your customer transactions and keeping track of the data that's collected at every step of the way. More importantly, to make sure you keep track of the customer consent to ensure that all information that you're collecting and using are legitimate in the sense that your customers have approved of that interaction. One of the things about this that is kind of a struggle for many companies is kind of with the multiple sources of data, how to really keep track of the different sources and making sure that everything is in line. Another key challenge is also incorporating the necessary privacy management options and data protection measures. As Sam covered just now, there's a lot of different kind of regulations and stuff to think about depending on the region that you're in or depending on the field that you're in. So really, and the type of data you're collecting, whether it's customer data, privacy information, company intelligence and whatnot, there's a lot to consider around there in terms of data protection measures. And then another large challenge, which we've kind of repeated touch on throughout the webinar so far, is the cost, the fees to becoming compliant, and then also the fees and necessary costs when you're not compliant as well. And then so one key thing that is really important for compliance, it's it's crucial to know exactly what you're collecting, and having that proper customer consent when collecting this data is also key, and making sure that the data is secure. A few ways you can kind of go about this and make sure that happens is to remove those data silos, to consolidate the multiple sources of data that you have into one central unified source so you can see and have a clear view of the data that you're collecting for each individual user. Another thing to keep in mind is make sure that you're providing consent and data transparency to your customers. As now, as Sam mentioned, privacy is a right for everybody. So making sure that, as your customers, as the users are able to kind of see exactly what information is being kept about them, and having that choice about how they want to interact with their business, what type of data they want to give you, and being able to understand how you're using that data. Another key aspect is, again, kind of that privacy, that security and compliance, making sure that you have the proper security measures in place, making sure that your company has the right compliance, the right certifications in place is also very important to managing that data. And then on the security front, encryption, making sure that everything is encrypted, both in transit and at rest, to make sure that, should anyone try to access that data, that they are not able to. And then that's where the customer identity management piece comes in handy. And as for, we kind of mentioned already now, LoginRadius, we're partnered with Microsoft. So, working together kind of really gives us, lets us being able to take advantage of all the key points and all the benefits that Microsoft Azure provides, as well as kind of Sam mentioned just now, kind of having the data in the cloud is really kind of really adds that security piece and that compliance piece as well, right? And a few of these things, kind of a few key points here is with the customer identity management, you get built-in privacy and consent management as well. So you're letting your customers choose how they want to interact with you, when they want to interact with you. It's essentially built-in self-serve directly into their profile. So also giving them transparency of the data as well. Another aspect is that regional data storage. As you saw earlier, there's that map that for all the different data centers that Microsoft Azure has around the world. Being a Microsoft partner and being deployed on the Microsoft Azure cloud, LoginRadius, we also have access to all those regional data storage to help you meet those regional compliances. And kind of in hand with that is to centralize that data storage. So streamline your data from your multiple resources to have a unified view. So that way, should any customer come in, you don't have any data points that are left behind. You have a clear view of the different data you're collecting from the different sources, whether it be from email subscription or something that they've entered or something that you've asked them to provide. Everything is essentially streamlined into one single view. You can see where the data came from. You can see essentially the consent that was provided by the customer to provide that data for you, to make sure that if any audits or any questions comes up, essentially that kind of leads into my next point. You have that full transparency, right? You have full transparency internally and externally, as well as along with one of the GDPR rights. One of the kind of the data privacy rights is the right to access. Customers now have a right to access and come and request businesses to provide all the data they're collecting and kind of all the different uses, essentially have a full view of what that company has on them. So with this full transparency, with the streamlining, you will be able to do that, along with audit trails for every single user. And then kind of looping back to that security, as mentioned, this touches on private data, personal data, company sensitive information. So any strict hashing and any strict data encryption is very important. And as LoginRadius, again, I mentioned, with using the Azure environment, we are able to work together, take advantage of all of the different encryption and security methodologies that Azure provides, as well as our own our own internal security that we have built on top of that. And then kind of tying it back to a real life example to give you a little bit of to give you a more clear view of how identity solution can help. Really, the 50 million euro fine for lack of consent could have been avoided if there was an identity management in place, right? So since it was lack of consent, to avoid that, they would have been able to easily, with the identity management solution, they would have been able to easily put in a privacy and consent options directly in the user profile for their users to essentially have a view so they can control what type of data they're providing and how the company can access that data. And also, that's also where the company can provide clear communication of how that data will be used. And then also another part of this management is notifying your users every time you update that privacy policy. Notifying your users automatically as they log in, as they do any kind of action, to let them know that, hey, we've updated our privacy policy, we've updated some of our terms. Please review, and so the users can essentially they're empowered to review on their own terms and kind of be able to give permission on their own terms and decide whether or not they want to partake in that data gathering in those activities. So just to summarize kind of everything we've talked about so far, so essentially as we kind of seen across the board, there are many companies that are still struggling to reach full GDPR compliance, and then as a result, fines have already been issued to a few of the major companies. And then on the flip side, consumers are also more aware now about their rights surrounding their data and how their personal information is used. As you know, this is really giving that power back to the customers to be able to control how their information is used and how they choose to share their information. And then on top of that, the customer identity solutions can really help resolve the challenges for GDPR compliance, especially the cloud solutions that is deployed on something like the Microsoft Azure environment, right? It really helps you comply with all of the global compliances, automatically provides you access to all of the necessary security certifications, and really has that built-in security piece as well regarding those data centers, those managed data centers and such.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Alice. That was great. So as we've seen, there are already significant fines being handed out to companies that aren't handling customer identity correctly. And all of these fines are entirely avoidable with a comprehensive customer identity management solution. We're actually going to be following up with the attendees today with a couple of resources for you that will help explain how you can become GDPR compliant and how the LoginRadius identity platform allows you to secure customer identities while remaining GDPR compliant at all times. So we just have a few minutes left here for today, so we're just going to take a look at a couple of questions. So just one initial question we have for is just how many fines in total have actually been handed out so far since GDPR came into effect?
So there has been 3 fines so far, with the Google at 50 million euro being the largest amount of those 3. And really it comes back to, into that customer consent piece, right? So it really comes back to clearly communicating and clearly being able to show, you know, the data that you're collecting and tying that with the customer's understanding of when they're providing that data, and essentially their approval to make sure that they want to provide that data for you, and really being able to see the kind of trace back to from the data to the customer consent piece.
Great. We just actually have a couple more questions kind of more specifically related to customer consent actually. And so are there any specific regulations in place specifically related to customer consent that people need to be following?
I think the most important part is to actually just to gather consent, right? So to make sure that that, again, like I mentioned, to make sure that every single piece of data that you're collecting, that you can trace back to that customer consent to where they have agreed for you to collect and provide that information. And another piece of that is to provide kind of a clear picture, a clear understanding, communicate that to your customers of what that data is, what you're collecting, and how that data is going to be used. So when they're agreeing to something, they're agreeing to they have full understanding into what they're agreeing to. Yeah.
And this is actually what Google were doing wrong and what led to them seeing one of the largest fines that we've seen so far.
Yeah, so again, that is that key piece, right? The whole Google fine is around the consent piece. They weren't able to provide that tie-in to, you know, here's all the personal information we have, here's everything that we're using it for, and they weren't able to provide evidence that they have gathered permission from their users to use the data in the way that they were.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we're just about out of time here today. So as I mentioned, we will be following up with a couple of resources for you to help you understand GDPR better. But we just want to finish just by thanking everybody for joining us. We hope you found the webinar informative. Thank you again to Sam and Alice for all of the really great information. And hopefully we'll see some more of you on some of our future webinars. So thanks again for everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.